James, he's a former actor, broadcaster in China, of all places.
Yes.
He left downtown Toronto, left the city behind, and is currently building a 40-acre homestead in northern Ontario.
Somewhere in the middle of 2024, people started noticing something was off. A YouTube channel that had been quietly building a devoted audience went unusually still. Comments were disabled. Replies stopped coming. And a man who had spent months documenting every log he lifted, every snowstorm he survived, and every system he built by hand in the Ontario wilderness had seemingly gone dark. What followed was a wave of speculation videos, Reddit threads, and thumbnail-heavy clickbait that turned a real person's deliberate choices into a mystery. But the actual story of what happened to James Alofs is far more interesting than any of those videos suggested. The silence that started everything. Before anyone understood what James Alofs was doing in the woods, they first had to reckon with the fact that he had gone quiet, and that the internet, left without an explanation, immediately assumed the worst. The concern started building gradually. Viewers who had been following his Wild Homestead channel noticed the comment section had been shut down. Then responses to questions stopped coming. Then the posting rhythm, which had been steady and reliable, became harder to track. For an audience that had been watching a man build a cabin from scratch in real time, the silence felt disproportionately loud. What made it stranger was the contrast. This wasn't someone who had been vague or distant with their audience from the beginning. James had been sharing the granular, unglamorous reality of off-grid life in central Ontario. The frozen mornings, the structural setbacks, the trial and error of systems that didn't work the first time. His audience had come to expect a certain consistency. When that consistency broke, even slightly, it read as a signal. By mid-2024, YouTube had filled with videos speculating about what had happened. Titles with words like disappearance, mystery, and shocking truth began appearing alongside thumbnails cut directly from James's own footage. The framing was dramatic. The evidence was thin. Most of these videos cycled through the same surface-level observations. He's less active, comments are off. Nobody knows where he is, without adding anything of substance. What those videos got wrong wasn't just the facts. They got the premise wrong. James Alofs hadn't disappeared. He had made a series of very deliberate choices about how he wanted to live and what he was willing to share publicly. And those choices looked, to people who hadn't been paying close attention, like an absence. To understand why any of that matters, you have to go back further than the cabin. Because the version of James Alofs, who moved to 40 acres of Ontario woodland in late 2023, was not the first version of this person that the world had encountered. And the gap between who he had been and who he was choosing to become is where the real story lives. The life he walked away from. Most of the people watching Wild Homestead videos of a man chopping wood and testing solar panels in a Canadian winter had no idea they were watching someone who had once been the most talked-about Canadian on Chinese television. James Alofs's path to the Ontario wilderness ran directly through some of the more unusual corners of international media. His breakthrough in China came in 2012, when he appeared on a Chinese dating show called The Bachelor, a format that had already become a significant cultural event in the country. James didn't just appear on the show, he proposed to one of the contestants on air, in a moment that made headlines across Canadian media and turned him into a recognizable figure to Chinese audiences almost overnight. For a Canadian actor, that kind of crossover attention was genuinely rare. The acting work that followed built on that visibility. He took on roles in Chinese film productions including The Mahjong Box, Rune of Blood, and Da Pudong, films that reached audiences already familiar with his name from the television appearance. His presence in the Chinese entertainment space wasn't a brief curiosity. It was a functioning career that gave him a platform he would eventually use in ways that had nothing to do with acting. Because, alongside the film work, James was developing a second identity as an environmental advocate. On Chinese social media platforms, he built a following of over 300,000 people around content focused on wildlife protection and opposition to infrastructure projects that he believed were damaging forest ecosystems. This wasn't a passive online presence. He spoke publicly against Ontario's proposed Highway 413, a controversial road project that critics argued would cut through protected land and wetlands. He participated in biological conservation podcasts. He appeared at environmental conferences from 2021 onward, engaging seriously with the policy dimensions of the issues he cared about. That's the version of James Alofs that existed before The Cabin. A Canadian actor with a significant Chinese media profile, a substantial social following, an active advocacy career, and a public identity that stretched across 2 countries and multiple platforms. The decision to walk away from that infrastructure, not in crisis, not after some public collapse, but as a deliberate redirect, is what makes his story genuinely unusual. Most people who build that kind of visibility spend the following years trying to protect and expand it. James spent his dismantling it, piece by piece, in favor of something that involved a lot more snow and a lot fewer followers. 40 acres and a camera. By the end of 2023, James had made the move official. He had purchased a 40-acre plot of land in central Ontario and begun the process of building a life on it from scratch. Not renovating an existing structure, not moving into something already habitable. Building, physically, manually, from the ground up. The Wild Homestead YouTube channel launched alongside this transition, and the early videos set the tone for everything that followed. There were no polished thumbnails designed to trigger clicks, no titles engineered to rank in search results, no production value beyond a camera placed somewhere useful and left to record. James building a roof. James splitting logs. James troubleshooting a wood stove. James checking animal traps in knee-deep snow. The channel was built around 3 interconnected ideas: self-sufficiency, practical survival, and genuine integration with the natural environment rather than domination of it. Every element of the project served one of those principles. The cabin wasn't prefabricated or assembled with hired labor. James dug the foundation himself, joined the timber himself, and built the roof himself. And every stage of that process was documented in videos that regularly ran between 30 and 60 minutes long. What the channel covered extended well beyond construction. As the project developed, the content expanded into the systems required to sustain off-grid life in a climate that doesn't offer much margin for error. Solar power setup and maintenance. The mechanics of keeping a titanium furnace running efficiently through an Ontario winter. Tapping maple trees for syrup. Soil management techniques aimed at increasing biodiversity on the land rather than extracting from it. Ontario winters in the region where James was living are serious. Temperatures that drop to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Ice accumulation that affects every system. Snow loads that test structural decisions made months earlier. The content reflected those conditions honestly, which meant it was sometimes unglamorous, sometimes repetitive in the way that real physical work is repetitive, and almost never optimized for casual viewing. That turned out to be precisely the point. By the end of 2024, Wild Homestead had passed 100,000 subscribers. The engagement numbers were significantly above what similar channels with comparable subscriber counts typically generated, which meant the audience wasn't just watching, they were invested. And the investment wasn't in a persona or a brand. It was in a process. People came back because they wanted to know what happened next with the roof, the water system, the solar setup, the winter. The channel had created continuity without manufacturing it. James also launched a companion project during this period, the Wild Ontario Podcast, released weekly, which extended the conversation beyond the cabin itself and into the broader ecological context. Episodes covering Ontario forest ecology, the spread of invasive oak fungus, the effects of climate change on migratory bird patterns, content that connected the personal experience of homesteading to the larger environmental questions James had been engaging with for years. The platform strategy that emerged by late 2023 was intentional and narrow. YouTube for the long-form documentary content, Instagram for shorter progress updates and landscape photography, the podcast for the environmental conversation. Everything else, TikTok, Twitter, and the high-frequency social platforms that had supported his earlier career, was dropped entirely. That reduction looked, to people who only saw the before and after, like retreat. From where James was standing, it was the opposite. What the internet decided had happened. The gap between what James was actually doing and what the internet decided had happened to him is worth examining closely because it reveals something about how online audiences process absence. The speculation videos that appeared through mid-2024 followed a recognizable template. Dramatic title, thumbnail pulled from James's own footage, voiceover that built toward a revelation the video couldn't actually deliver. The core claim was usually some version of James Alofs has vanished and nobody knows why. The problem was that none of the evidence supported it. James was posting new wild homestead videos on a consistent monthly basis throughout the period when he was supposedly missing. The podcast was releasing weekly. His Instagram was active. The channel was growing. What the speculation was actually responding to was something more specific. James had disabled comments on his YouTube channel. And for an audience accustomed to treating comment sections as a dialogue, that felt like a door closing. James has never publicly explained that decision in direct terms, but the context makes the reasoning fairly readable. Someone managing 40 acres of land through a Canadian winter, building and maintaining physical infrastructure without outside help, running a podcast, and producing long-form video content does not have significant time available for moderating a comment section or responding individually to the volume of questions that a 100,000 subscriber channel generates. Disabling comments isn't disappearing, it's managing bandwidth. Reddit threads during this period asked questions that were more grounded, but still speculative. The most discussed was the financial one. How was James paying for all of this? The land purchase alone had put him in debt by his own indirect admission. The solar equipment, the machinery, the building materials, the transportation costs, the supplies needed to survive winters at -30. None of it was cheap. And he had no obvious sponsorships, no affiliate products, no membership tier, no online course. The most plausible answer, and the one most Reddit commenters eventually landed on, was a combination of YouTube revenue from a high-engagement channel that had crossed the threshold where monetization becomes meaningful, podcast income from distribution platforms, and savings carried over from a career in entertainment and advocacy that had spanned more than a decade. It's not a glamorous financial picture, but it's a functional one, and it's consistent with the scale at which James was operating. The financial mystery also pointed at something more fundamental about how James had structured Wild Homestead from the beginning. He had made a deliberate decision to keep the channel free of commercial partnerships. No call for donations, no affiliate links attached to the gear he used, no course teaching viewers how to replicate what he was doing for a fee. For a channel with his engagement numbers, that represented real money left on the table. The choice was consistent with everything else about how Wild Homestead was designed. It was a personal project shared publicly, not a product. The moment it became a product, it would require James to start making decisions in service of the product, rather than in service of the project. He had spent enough time in the media and entertainment world to know exactly how that dynamic worked, and he had chosen to build something that operated outside it. What was actually happening in the woods? While the speculation was cycling through YouTube thumbnails and Reddit threads, the reality in central Ontario was considerably less mysterious and considerably more demanding. Off-grid life in a Canadian winter is not content. It's maintenance. Every day involves physical tasks that don't wait for a convenient schedule. Keeping the fire going, monitoring the solar system, managing water that wants to freeze, clearing snow from structures that weren't designed to carry unlimited weight. The pace of that life is incompatible with the pace of constant social media output, and the people who had expected James to maintain the high-frequency posting rhythm of his earlier career were measuring him against a standard that the life he was living had made structurally impossible. What James had done in moving to the homestead was reorganize his entire relationship with time, not just the hours in his day, but the metric he was using to evaluate whether he was doing well. In the media and entertainment world, the relevant measure is reach: followers, views, shares, engagement rate. In the Ontario wilderness in February, the relevant measure is whether the cabin is warm, the water is running, and the structure is holding up. Those two measurement systems don't coexist comfortably. The people who had followed James's career before Wild Homestead, the Chinese social media audience, the viewers from his acting work, the followers who had engaged with his environmental advocacy, were observing someone who had genuinely changed what he was optimizing for. That's disorienting to watch, especially from a platform-based relationship where the expectation is continuity of persona. What James had kept consistent from the beginning of Wild Homestead through every subsequent phase was the line between his life and his content. The channel documented the work on the land, the construction, the systems, the relationship with the ecosystem. It did not document his personal life. His relationship status was not discussed. The exact location of the property was not shared. His financial arrangements were not detailed. From the very first video, the content had been scoped to the project, not the person. That restraint was not incidental. It was the architecture of the whole thing. By keeping personal information out of the channel, James had created a version of public sharing that didn't require ongoing personal exposure to sustain. The content could continue without him having to continuously offer himself as the subject. The land, the building process, the ecological environment, those were the story. He was just the person doing the work. For an audience trained by years of personal brand content, to expect the creator's full self as part of the product, that boundary read as withholding. For James, it was the condition that made the whole project sustainable. What really happened and what it actually means. Here is what the evidence, taken together, actually shows. James Alofs did not disappear. He did not have a breakdown, a scandal, a legal crisis, or a personal collapse that drove him off the grid. He made a series of choices, each of them consistent with the one before it, that moved him progressively further from the infrastructure of mass media visibility and closer to a life organized around physical self-sufficiency and environmental engagement. Those choices started before Wild Homestead. The advocacy work in China and Ontario was already a departure from the pure entertainment career. The decision to build an audience around wildlife protection and infrastructure policy, rather than trading on his television profile for more commercial opportunities, was an early signal about what he valued. When he eventually bought the 40 acres and started building, he wasn't escaping a life that had failed him. He was extending a direction he had already been moving in for years. The discomfort that produced all the speculation videos was real, but it wasn't about James. It was about what audiences expect from creators who have built a relationship with them online. The implicit contract of social media is continuity. You show up regularly, you share updates, you respond to comments, you remain available. James had honored parts of that contract: the regular videos, the podcast, the Instagram updates, while refusing others. And the parts he refused were precisely the ones that would have required him to prioritize the relationship with the audience over the relationship with the project. That's a genuinely unusual position for someone with his reach to take. Most creators at his level, facing the kind of speculation that circulated in mid-2024, would have posted a response video, addressed the rumors directly, used the controversy to generate traffic. James didn't do any of that, not because he was hiding something, but because responding to speculation would have meant operating on terms set by people who had misread the situation, and he had never operated that way. The Wild Ontario podcast, still releasing weekly as of the time this was written, covers topics that have nothing to do with his personal circumstances and everything to do with the ecosystem he is living inside. The YouTube channel continues to document the homestead's development. The Instagram tracks the visual progress of the land and the build. None of that is the behavior of someone who has disappeared. It is the behavior of someone who decided, with a level of clarity that most people never develop, what kind of presence he wanted to have in the world, and then built his entire infrastructure around that decision, regardless of what the commentary suggested he should do instead. The irony of all the disappearance content is that it is the exact kind of noise James had spent years learning to tune out. His response to it was to keep posting videos about building a cabin in the snow, which, if you think about it, tells you everything you need to know about what actually happened to James Alofs. He just went to go build something real. Now it's time to hear from you. What are your thoughts about this? Share with us in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.